The virtue of temperance, especially in its primordial forms of chastity and abstinence, relates to the root of the whole sensual intellectual life. Moderation extends its ordering mastery down to the fountainhead from which the figure of mortal man springs up unceasingly. That quote is from 20th century German philosopher Josef Pieper, specifically from a chapter on the virtue of temperance in his book, The Four Cardinal Virtues. In it, he explains how temperance is the key to ordering our entire inner life, starting with our two most fundamental capacities for self-preservation: nourishment, eating and drinking, and sexuality. He argues that those two aspects of our lives need to be ordered because they are so important to our existence and are so easily capable of growing out of control. I explored that topic in another video linked below, but in it, I didn't have time to explore a critical follow-up question. What do we do if we are struggling with intemperance? How do we bring back order to that part of our life? Well, in order to know the answer to those questions, we'll first need to understand the answer to these three questions. First, what is fasting? Second, what is celibacy? And third, what are the consequences if we remain intemperate? And if you stick around to the end, I'll also share a secret key to becoming temperate, which I don't think it's what you expect. It certainly wasn't for me. Okay, so to start, a general principle of classical ethics, which is the school of thought that Pieper is coming from, is that a vice is the result of either too much or too little of a certain type of behavior, when we should be acting in the ideal middle path. For example, intemperance with food and drink would be either consuming too much or too little. Interestingly, in order to get ourselves back to the middle or mean, we should actually aim in the opposite direction more than we would otherwise if we weren't having any issues. In other words, we should consciously overshoot the true equilibrium point because our subconscious habits will actually bring us back in the opposite direction and we'll end up close to the middle, which is exactly where we want to be. It's a bit like if your car is out of alignment and tends to drift to the right, you actually have to oversteer a bit to the left to go straight. Going back to the example of food, it would mean that if we tend to eat too much, we should try to eat less than we would actually need. But of course, we shouldn't starve ourselves. In other words, we should fast. To be clear, the point here is not to punish ourselves or even to speed run a diet, but rather to train our desires and bring them back in alignment with reality. It's sort of like physical therapy, but for our mind. It can be painful, but it's also corrective, not a mean-spirited self-punishment. The goal is to actualize our inner potential. Pieper has a great quote explaining this in more detail. He writes, "Whoever has not reached the maturity of perfection, that is, all of us ordinary Christians, could not preserve, without recourse to the medicine, the discipline of fasting, that inner order by virtue of which the turbulence of sensuality is kept in check, and the spirit liberated, so that it may soar into the zone of its appropriate fulfillment and satisfaction. It is here, most particularly and strikingly, that the stern demands inherent in the Christian image of man become compellingly visible. Our natural duty obliges us to pay dearly, so that we may become what we are by essence, the free, moral person in full possession of himself." Sounds pretty good to me. Another interesting point that Pieper is making here is that fasting doesn't relate just to food. It helps us strengthen our overall self-control, our willpower, so that we're less likely to be pushed around by our desires in general, whether that's for food, going to bed on time, or anything else. Fasting, and in general, these types of practices of measured self-denial also helps us familiarize ourselves with the pains associated with the struggle for self-control, but at a pace that we can control. If you're familiar with exercise science, it's a bit like progressive overload, but for your inner self, and helps prepare us for days when we can't avoid our weak points, like when a coworker brings in a fresh box of donuts in the morning. Now, before moving on to the second question, I want to make one thing clear. Since virtue is the mean or middle between two extremes, we can, but we shouldn't, go too far when it comes to fasting. In fact, Pieper says that we know we go too far when we end up weakening our ability to sense spiritual things. For example, if you're hanging out with family and friends and you can't enjoy their company and all you can think about is food, you've probably gone too far. Pieper actually says that ideally cheerfulness and fasting go together, which I thought was pretty surprising, but it does sound like an interesting idea. In any case, the whole point of fasting is that it's like a spiritual palate cleanser so that we can retune our senses to reality and interact with the world more accurately. Beyond this, Pieper also makes the point over and over again that we shouldn't fast because we think physical things are bad. You may have noticed in the quote that Pieper is a Christian, and he also asserts that God created the world as good, even if good things can be used for bad purposes. Again, for Pieper, fasting is a way to ensure that we are acting in harmony with reality. Okay, so now that we know that the first remedy to intemperance is fasting, it might not surprise you to learn that Pieper proposes a similar approach when it comes to reproduction. Specifically, Pieper argues that we can optimize our sexual desires or achieve chastity through the practice of celibacy. To use Pieper's language, celibacy, or the practice of abstaining from sexual activity, helps bring the order of reason into the realm of human sexuality when a person is excessively overwhelmed by sexual desire. Pieper explains, "The being of man in its essential significance consists in this, to be in accord with reason. If therefore a man keeps to what is in accord with reason, he is said to keep himself in himself. Unchastity destroys in a very special manner this self-possession and this human keeping of oneself in oneself. Unchaste abandon and the self-surrender of the soul to the world of sensuality paralyzes the primordial powers of the mortal person, the ability to perceive in silence the call of reality, and to make, in the retreat of the silence, the decision appropriate to the concrete situation of concrete action. This is the meaning inherent in all those propositions which speak of the falsification and corruption of prudence, of the blindness of the spirit, and of the splitting of the power of decision." Yikes. By the way, you might have noticed in the quote that Pieper is arguing that unchastity or intemperance when it comes to sexuality has a number of negative effects, including the corruption of prudence. Prudence is another cardinal virtue and concerns our ability to make good choices. Indeed, this is a key theme for Pieper. The virtues do not exist in isolation, but mutually support each other. In particular, unchastity erodes the human person's ability to be prudent. That is, the ability to make good, rational decisions. Prudence is the perfection of our conscience, or our inner ability to make good choices, and if you'd like to learn more, I'll link another video I made below. Interestingly, just as vices make other related virtues more difficult, virtues can make other related virtues easier. In particular, Pieper says that the virtue of wrath, or justified anger, is a critical response to unchastity, or specifically its precursor, lust. Now, if a person doesn't have a big problem with unchastity, the first remedy he recommends is flight, aka avoiding the situation, like saying no to the invitation from a friend to visit a certain type of nightclub. But if someone is already struggling with this, wrath or justified anger is critical to getting back on the right track. Wrath allows us to actually enjoy tackling the problem head on. A good example for this might be going for a run or working out at the gym. Key is to channel our anger and frustration to give us the willpower to use our time and energy for something good. This is the secret key that I mentioned earlier in the video, and it caught me by surprise when I was doing research for this video. Pieper goes so far as to say that wrath is the clearest expression of the energy of human nature and is, quote, the power of resistance in the soul. Indeed, part of his point is that justified anger actually gives us a certain pleasure in responding to our unchaste desires, and actually exceeds the pleasure that we would get from giving in to our desires. Rather than trying to be a robot, the goal is to use our energy and desires for good, for activities that are enjoyable and sustainable. He argues that we have a better chance of success if we do good deeds passionately rather than emotionlessly, and thus ultimately, wrath can help defend our reason against passions that would otherwise blind us. Of course, this anger needs to be justified and well-directed. Pieper names blind wrath and excessive resentment as two examples of when we let things go too far. Ultimately, the main point is that complementary virtues helps us live a whole and complete life, ready for whatever we face. For those that made it to this point, thanks for sticking around. Before we call it quits, let's first do a quick recap. In this video, we saw that there are two key remedies for intemperance, namely fasting and celibacy. They help bring our desires back into moderation by overshooting what would normally be the mean or the ideal balance. And ultimately, we saw that wrath is our surprising ace in the hole when it comes to unchastity. Until next time, friends.